The Vorthon assault fleet dropped out of hyperspace expecting to find terrified human colonists waiting to be evacuated from New Sol. Instead, they found empty cities that looked like they had been abandoned for months. Commander Bei Tae-hyun had moved his people according to carefully prepared plans, but he had left behind surprises that would teach the aliens their first lesson about fighting humans. General Kretal himself had come to oversee what should have been a simple operation. His massive command ship hung in orbit above the human colony world, while his sensors showed him exactly what he expected to see. No military vessels, no orbital defenses, no signs of resistance from a species too weak to challenge Vorthon might. The first wave of landing craft descended toward the planet's major cities, carrying elite Vorthon shock troops who had conquered dozens of worlds. These soldiers wore advanced battle armor that could stop any known human weapon and carried plasma rifles that could melt through the strongest materials humanity had ever developed. But as the landing craft approached the seemingly empty cities, they began detecting something unexpected. Energy readings that did not match any known technology, movement patterns that suggested active systems despite the apparent abandonment, heat signatures that indicated machinery still running in buildings that should have been powered down. Commander Bei watched the alien ships approach from his hidden command bunker deep beneath the planetary surface. The human evacuation had been real enough, but it had also been carefully planned to draw the enemy into positions where they would be most vulnerable to weapons they had never encountered. The first Vorthon troops landed in the central plaza of New Sol's capital city. Their scanners showed empty buildings and deserted streets exactly as their intelligence had predicted. They began moving toward strategic positions with the confidence of soldiers who had never faced serious resistance from primitive species. Then, the city came alive around them. What the aliens had mistaken for abandoned buildings were actually automated defense networks that had been studying their approach and learning their movement patterns. The systems had been designed by human engineers who understood that they could not build weapons stronger than alien technology, but they could build weapons that were smarter. The first defense turret that emerged from what appeared to be a decorative fountain was destroyed immediately by Vorthon plasma fire. But before it died, the turret transmitted detailed information about alien weapon capabilities, armor effectiveness, and tactical responses to other systems throughout the city. The second turret that popped up 30 seconds later had already adapted to counter the plasma weapons that had destroyed its predecessor. The third turret was immune to both plasma fire and the kinetic rounds that killed the second one. By the time the fifth turret activated, it was using technology that the original designers had never imagined, because it had evolved responses to threats they had never seen. General Kretal watched in growing confusion as his elite troops began taking casualties from an enemy that seemed to learn from every engagement. Weapons that worked perfectly in the first wave became useless in the second. As the defense systems evolved countermeasures faster than his tactical officers could adapt their strategies. The aquatic Hydron Empire had sent their best underwater assault troops to capture New Busan's ocean cities. The Hydrons were amphibious beings who could breathe both air and water, and their technology was specifically designed for aquatic combat. They had never lost a battle on any world that had significant water coverage. Lieutenant Commander Park Ji-won had spent months preparing for their arrival. As Earth's leading expert on underwater combat, she had studied every available record of Hydron military tactics and had prepared defenses that turned the planet's seas into a death trap designed specifically for their opponents. The Hydron assault began at dawn with thousands of their soldiers emerging from the depths to attack coastal installations. Their commanders expected to find human defenders struggling to fight in an environment where they would be completely outmatched. Instead, they found ocean creatures that looked like harmless marine life, but exploded with devastating force when threatened. The artificial sea creatures had been designed to mimic local wildlife so perfectly that even advanced alien sensors could not detect them until it was too late. Schools of robotic fish that released clouds of metal-eating bacteria when Hydron equipment came too close. Artificial coral reefs that generated electrical fields specifically tuned to disrupt Hydron nervous systems. But the most terrifying surprise was the mines that had been scattered throughout the ocean depths. These devices remained completely inactive until they detected specific alien biosignatures, at which point they activated with explosive force designed to be lethal to Hydron physiology, while leaving Earth marine life completely unharmed. The Hydron casualties mounted with every hour as their soldiers discovered that humans had turned the ocean itself into a weapon. Their advanced underwater cities became death traps as human-designed systems shut down life support, pumped in toxic gases, and locked escape routes with timing that suggested intimate knowledge of Hydron psychology and tactics. Most shocking of all was the defense of New Daegu, where Captain Song Woo-jin implemented a strategy that no council species had ever encountered. Instead of fighting to hold territory, the human forces deliberately retreated, drawing the enemy deeper into carefully prepared kill zones. The insectoid hive mind clusters had been chosen for this assault because their perfect coordination and overwhelming numbers made them ideal for urban combat. They moved in synchronized swarms that could overwhelm any defense through sheer weight of numbers, and their shared consciousness made them immune to the confusion and fear that affected individual soldiers. Dr. Lee Hyo-jung had spent years studying their telepathic communication systems and had developed sonic weapons that disrupted the neural frequencies they used to coordinate their actions. When the weapons activated the perfect coordination that made the clusters so dangerous, turned into complete chaos as individual insects lost contact with their collective mind. The result was horrifying for the aliens and grimly satisfying for human observers. Coordinated swarms became confused mobs that attacked each other as often as they attacked human targets. Individual insects wandered aimlessly without the guidance of their collective intelligence. The cluster's greatest strength had become their most devastating weakness. Captain Song's forces retreated through the city, according to carefully planned routes that maximized alien casualties while preserving human lives. Every building had been prepared with surprises designed to exploit specific alien weaknesses. Every street intersection became a kill zone where human defenders could strike and fade before enemy reinforcements arrived. The aliens found themselves fighting an enemy that refused to stand and fight according to established military doctrine. Human soldiers appeared from nowhere, struck with devastating effect, and vanished before effective counterattacks could be organized. Buildings that appeared empty contained hidden weapon systems that activated only when alien forces were in optimal positions for maximum casualties. Within 72 hours, the Galactic Council's easy conquest had turned into a nightmare of constant casualties and zero territorial gains. Their commanders found themselves requesting reinforcements for what should have been a simple police action against a primitive species. The first video transmission from the human resistance reached Council headquarters on the fourth day of the invasion. Commander Bay stood among the wreckage of a Vorthan command post that his forces had destroyed using weapons that Council intelligence had never seen before. His uniform was dirty, and his face showed the strain of continuous combat, but his eyes blazed with determination that made veteran alien warriors step back from their viewing screens. Behind him, human soldiers moved through the wreckage with confidence that suggested they were winning a war that should have been impossible for them to survive. "You wanted our worlds," he said in a voice that carried clearly despite the battle damage around him. "Come and claim them, but know that every meter of ground will cost you more than you can afford to pay." The message ended with footage that sent shockwaves through Council leadership. Human soldiers emerging from hidden bunkers that their sensors had never detected. Weapons that used principles their scientists did not recognize. Most disturbing of all, tactics that violated every rule of civilized warfare while somehow remaining technically legal under galactic conventions. The humans were not just fighting, they were winning. And they were doing it using methods that no military academy in Council space had ever taught, because no species had ever been desperate enough or creative enough to develop such approaches. General Kretal demanded additional forces, claiming that human resistance was stronger than intelligence reports had indicated. The Hydron Empire requested specialized equipment to counter weapons that should not have been possible for such a primitive species to develop. The hive mind clusters asked for psychic shielding technology that had never been needed in previous conflicts. But the most disturbing reports came from alien soldiers who had survived direct contact with human forces. They described an enemy that seemed to know exactly how to exploit weaknesses that even Admiral Yoon Hee-jin's fleet emerged from hyperspace at the edge of Vorthan territory, and the real war began. The humans were no longer defending their worlds. They were taking the fight directly to their enemies, and the galaxy was about to discover what happened when a species that excelled at adaptation decided to go on the offensive. The Battle of Kepler Station would become legendary throughout Council space as the moment when human warfare evolved from desperate defense to systematic destruction of enemy capabilities. Council forces had expected human ships to behave like every other species they had encountered, predictable formations, standard tactics, and conventional weapons. Instead, they faced Captain Seo Minjun's experimental squadron that fought like no military force in galactic history. Human ships did not form neat battle lines or follow established combat doctrines. They moved like a swarm of angry insects, each vessel operating independently, while maintaining perfect coordination through methods that alien tacticians could not understand. The human vessels were smaller than standard Council warships and appeared to be built using primitive materials and outdated technology. But appearances were deceiving in ways that cost alien commanders dearly. Human engineers had designed ships that were meant to be underestimated while carrying weapons that exploited weaknesses no alien species had ever considered. Captain Seo's flagship, the Sol Dawn, looked like nothing more than a modified cargo hauler that had been hastily converted for military use. But when the battle began, it released a swarm of attack drones that moved with coordination that surpassed even the most advanced alien artificial intelligence systems. The drones were not controlled by any central computer system that could be jammed or disrupted. Instead, they operated using principles borrowed from Earth biology, where simple individual units could create complex group behaviors without any central authority. Each drone made its own decisions based on local conditions while contributing to an overall strategy that emerged from their collective actions. Admiral Cree Moore of the Vorthon Defense Fleet watched in growing alarm as his superior numbers and firepower failed to achieve the quick victory that Council doctrine promised. His ships followed established battle formations that had worked perfectly for thousands of years, but human vessels seemed to anticipate every move and counter every strategy. The turning point came when human ships began using ramming attacks that would have been suicidal for any other species. But human vessels had been designed to survive collisions that would shatter alien hulls, and their pilots had trained for scenarios that Council tacticians considered impossible to survive. The UES Busan under Captain Kim Dae-ho deliberately crashed into a Vorthon battlecruiser at full speed. The alien ship was destroyed instantly, while the human vessel emerged from the wreckage with hull breaches that should have been fatal. Instead of sinking, the ship's automated repair systems began sealing the damage, while the crew prepared for their next attack. Commander Kang Yu-jin led the boarding actions that terrified Council crews more than any weapon. Human Marines did not simply capture enemy ships, they turned them into examples of what happened to species that threatened humanity. Alien survivors would whisper for years about human soldiers who seemed to appear from nowhere and fought with a combination of advanced technology and primitive savagery. The boarding techniques used by human forces violated every expectation that alien defenders had about civilized warfare. Human soldiers moved through ship corridors using routes that ship designers had never intended for combat. They used the enemy's own technology against them in ways that demonstrated intimate knowledge of alien psychology and engineering principles. Captain Kang's most famous operation involved the capture of the Vorthon command ship, Eternal Dominance. His team infiltrated the massive vessel through waste disposal systems that alien security had never considered vulnerable. They moved through the ship's infrastructure like viruses spreading through a body, systematically disabling defensive systems while remaining undetected. When they finally revealed their presence, the psychological impact was devastating. The Vorthon command staff discovered that humans had been moving freely through their most secure vessel for hours, learning their plans, monitoring their communications, and sabotaging their equipment without triggering a single alarm. The Crystalline Collective had never experienced fear because their silicon-based psychology was fundamentally different from organic species. They made decisions based on pure logic, without the emotional responses that could be exploited by psychological warfare. They considered themselves immune to the mental tactics that humans had used against other council members. Lieutenant Park, Su Min's psychological warfare division, had spent months studying crystalline thought patterns and had developed techniques that could break minds that considered themselves unbreakable. The key was understanding that logic-based species had their own forms of mental vulnerability that no organic species had ever learned to exploit. The breakthrough came when human researchers discovered that crystalline beings could be driven into logical paradox loops that were the equivalent of organic panic attacks. By presenting them with problems that had no logical solutions, human forces could cause complete mental shutdown in beings that had never experienced cognitive failure. Dr. Lim J. Young's research team had cracked the genetic codes of every council species during years of peaceful scientific exchange. When the council began using chemical weapons against human colonies, Dr. Lim's response was swift, precise, and absolutely devastating. The biological weapons that human forces deployed were perfectly targeted to affect only aggressive alien species, while leaving neutral life forms completely unharmed. Fourth-hand soldiers began dying from diseases that attacked their specific genetic markers. Hydron troops found their breathing apparatus failing due to bacteria that had been designed to exploit their unique physiology. The weapons were so precisely calibrated that they could distinguish between alien soldiers and alien civilians, between aggressive species and peaceful observers, between combatants and non-combatants, with accuracy that previous biological warfare could never achieve. Captain Nam Bora's cyber warfare unit had infiltrated Council communication networks so completely that alien commanders never knew if their orders were authentic or if human-generated false commands were causing chaos throughout their military hierarchy. Cyber attacks were not simple disruptions or data theft operations. Instead, they were sophisticated psychological operations that used each species' own communication protocols against them. Vorthan commanders began receiving orders that appeared to come from their superiors, but actually led their forces into carefully prepared ambushes. The hive mind clusters found their telepathic networks infiltrated by signals that mimicked their own mental patterns. Human technicians had learned to generate thoughts that felt authentic to the collective consciousness, but contained instructions that benefited human tactical objectives. Most devastating of all was the capture operation that changed the entire nature of the conflict. Colonel Kim Jun-ho's Special Forces team successfully penetrated the most secure facility in Council space and captured a Council hierarch alive. Hierarch Vex Prime had ruled star systems for over 1,000 years from behind defenses that had never been breached by any enemy force. He commanded fleets that could destroy entire worlds and possessed technology that could reshape matter at the molecular level. The idea that primitive humans could threaten him had been literally unthinkable, but Colonel Kim's team had studied the facility for months using intelligence gathered through supposedly peaceful diplomatic exchanges. They knew every security protocol, every defensive system, and every psychological assumption that protected the most powerful beings in the galaxy. The infiltration took place during a formal council session when Hierarch Vex Prime believed himself to be completely safe. Human operatives had replaced key security personnel over a period of weeks, using disguise technology that could fool even the most advanced alien sensors. When the Hierarch found himself in human custody facing interrogation techniques that made traditional torture seem gentle, the psychological impact rippled through Council leadership. For the first time in galactic history, beings who had considered themselves untouchable gods discovered that they were as vulnerable as any other creature when faced with human determination. The news of the Hierarch's capture spread through Council space faster than official military communications. Species that had served the Galactic Order for millennia began to question whether their masters were truly invincible. Military commanders who had never doubted ultimate victory began to wonder if they were fighting an enemy that could not be. Defeated Admiral Yoon surveyed the tactical displays showing human victories across multiple star systems and allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. The species that had dismissed humanity as primitive apes was learning that underestimating humans was a mistake that could not be survived. The tide had turned, and the galaxy was beginning to understand that they were not fighting a desperate resistance by a doomed species. They were facing the emergence of a new dominant power that would reshape the universe according to human values and human determination. The war was far from over, but the outcome was no longer. The name human had become a whispered curse throughout Council space. Species that had dominated the galaxy for millennia were experiencing something completely alien to their nature. Genuine, paralyzing fear of creatures they had initially dismissed as harmless primitives. On the core world of Zentax Prime, Chancellor Vex 9 of the Machine Collective called an emergency session. The holographic displays showed the devastation spreading across Council territory like a virus. 17. Major military installations had fallen to human forces. 43 supply worlds had been captured or destroyed. The humans weren't just winning battles. They were systematically dismantling the infrastructure that had supported Council dominance for 2,000 years. "They fight like demons," reported General Thrak from the Crustacean Armor Shell Empire, his massive claws clicking nervously against the conference table. "Our soldiers flee at the mere mention of human presence. They have turned warfare into something unnatural." Captain Zhong. Dawu's reputation had spread through Council space like wildfire. Captured aliens spoke of a human commander who seemed to be everywhere at once, who anticipated their moves before they made them, and who left behind calling cards that drove survivor crews to madness. His signature was simple: a small earth flower placed on the bridge of every captured vessel, a reminder that beauty and death could share the same source. The psychological impact was devastating. Colonel Shin Yun-ah had weaponized human creativity in ways that alien minds couldn't comprehend. She turned Council victories into Pyrrhic disasters by ensuring that every human defeat cost the enemy more than they could sustain. When forced to retreat, her forces left behind works of art made from alien equipment, sculptures that told stories of human resilience and alien failure. Dr. Han Seok-jin's medical teams had discovered something that terrified Council strategists. More than any weapon, humans were adapting to alien environments faster than any species in recorded history. Soldiers who had fought in toxic atmospheres developed natural immunity. Crews exposed to alien pathogens became carriers of modified diseases that devastated Council biological warfare research stations. The hive mind clusters, once the Council's most feared military force, had been reduced to scattered fragments. Major Kim Sora had developed tactics that exploited their collective consciousness, turning their greatest strength into a devastating weakness. When one cluster experienced human psychological warfare, the trauma spread through their entire neural network, crippling thousands of creatures with a single operation. But the most terrifying development was the emergence of what Council intelligence classified as human adaptive syndrome. Soldiers who fought humans for extended periods began exhibiting human-like tactical thinking, questioning orders, and developing individual creativity that disrupted traditional command structures. The infection of human behavioral patterns was spreading through Council forces faster than their commanders could contain it. The final straw came when Lieutenant Commander Park Young-ho's infiltration team successfully penetrated the Grand Council chamber itself. They didn't attack, didn't destroy, didn't conquer. They simply left behind a message written in perfect galactic standard. "We know where you live. We know how you think. We know your weaknesses. Surrender now, or learn why humans never lose wars they choose to finish." The emergency session of the United Earth Government began exactly 6 hours after Captain Lee's ship entered Earth's solar system. Representatives from every nation, every colony, and every space station had gathered in the Great Assembly Hall in Geneva. The building had been expanded 3 times since first contact with alien life, but it still felt too small for the weight of the decision that lay before humanity. President Kim Min-ho stood at the central podium looking out at faces that reflected every possible human emotion. Fear was there, certainly, but it was mixed with anger, determination, and something that alien psychologists would have found impossible to understand. Humans facing impossible odds did not simply calculate their chances of survival and surrender. When the math looked bad, the president had spent his entire political career working toward peaceful integration with galactic civilization. He had believed that humanity could find its place among the stars through diplomacy, trade, and gradual technological advancement. The Council's ultimatum had shattered those hopes, but it had also revealed something important about the universe that surrounded Earth. Dr. Park So-young had transmitted her complete psychological profiles of the major alien species during the flight home. Her analysis painted a picture of galactic civilization that was both more advanced and more limited than humanity had realized. These beings had achieved incredible technological mastery, but they had paid a price that humans were only beginning to understand. The species that dominated the galaxy had become predictable in ways that made them powerful, but also vulnerable. They had developed perfect military techniques that worked against every enemy they had ever encountered. They had created social systems that eliminated conflict by ensuring that everyone knew their proper place. They had solved the problems of resource allocation by accepting that stronger species naturally deserved more than weaker ones. But in solving these problems, they had lost something that humans still possessed. They had forgotten how to adapt quickly to completely new situations. They had lost the ability to think creatively when established methods failed. Most importantly, they had never learned to unite completely when facing extinction because they had never faced an enemy that threatened their entire way of life. President Kim began his address by reading the exact terms of the Council's ultimatum. The silence in the chamber was absolute as he described the 30-day deadline, the demanded evacuations, and the requirement that humanity surrender its independence. When he finished reading the formal document, he set it aside and looked directly at the assembled representatives. "They think we are weak because we prefer diplomacy to conquest," he said in a voice that carried to every corner of the vast hall. "They mistake our desire for peace as inability to wage war. Today we show them the error in their judgment." The response from the assembly was immediate and unanimous. Delegates who had spent years arguing about trade policies and colonial rights stood as one body and began chanting a simple phrase that had echoed through human history whenever their species faced annihilation: "No surrender, no retreat, no compromise with those who would enslave the human spirit." Admiral Yoon Hee-jin stepped forward to present the military situation. At 35, she was the youngest person ever to command Earth's space forces, but she had earned her position through a combination of tactical brilliance and an intuitive understanding of how humans fought differently from other species. "The numbers look grim on paper," she admitted, as holographic displays showed the massive disparity between human and alien military capabilities. "We have 57 capital ships compared to their thousands. Our population barely reaches 12 billion while they command trillions. Their technology appears centuries ahead of our capabilities." She paused dramatically before continuing with a smile that made several delegates lean forward in their seats. "But numbers do not tell the complete story," she said, as the displays changed to show detailed analyses of alien combat patterns. "Every council species follows predictable strategies that have worked for them for thousands of years. They have fought the same types of enemies using the same proven tactics for so long that they cannot imagine any other way to conduct warfare." Admiral gestured to tactical displays showing battle formations that had been used throughout galactic history. These patterns were elegant, efficient, and completely effective against any rational opponent who followed established rules of engagement. But humans had never been particularly rational when their survival was at stake. They have never faced humans. In actual combat, she continued, and her voice took on a tone that made experienced military officers throughout the chamber sit up straighter. "They do not understand that we see their strengths as opportunities to exploit their weaknesses. They do not realize that their predictability makes them vulnerable to opponents who refuse to fight by their rules." Colonel Oh Sung-min took the podium next to outline humanity's strategic advantages. His special operations background had taught him to find ways to win when conventional victory seemed impossible, and he had spent years studying how humans could compete with technologically superior opponents. "We will not fight a conventional war," he announced firmly. "Instead, we will use guerrilla tactics, psychological warfare, and asymmetric strategies that will confuse and demoralize enemies who have never encountered such methods. Every human advantage will be exploited to maximum effect." He activated displays, showing the preparations that had been made in secret over the past several years. While alien species had assumed that humans were simply trying to catch up technologically, Earth's military and scientific communities had been developing approaches to warfare that no galactic power had ever considered. Dr. Choi Young-soo stepped forward to reveal the technological surprises that humanity had prepared. As Earth's leading physicist, he had spent the last decade not trying to copy alien technology, but rather developing uniquely human alternatives that would be completely unexpected. While the Council focused on bigger guns and stronger shields, Dom developed weapons based on principles they have never encountered. He explained as the displays showed devices that looked deceptively simple compared to standard galactic military equipment, quantum disruption fields that could disable alien electronics. By exploiting weaknesses in their design philosophy, gravitational pulse weapons that used the enemy's own mass against them, nanoswarm technology that could think and adapt faster than any organic brain, could process information. But the most important advantage was something that could not be displayed on any screen or measured by any instrument. Humanity possessed a unity of purpose that alien species had lost somewhere in their rise to galactic dominance. When humans faced extinction, they did not calculate odds or negotiate terms. They simply decided to win, regardless of the cost. Engineer Namhayarim presented the industrial mobilization plan that would turn Earth's entire manufacturing capacity toward military production. Every factory, every laboratory, and every construction facility would be converted to support the war effort. Civilian populations would accept rationing and hardship without complaint because they understood what was at stake. General Kim Tae-won outlined the recruitment and training programs that would turn ordinary citizens into soldiers capable of fighting alien beings who had never known defeat. Human adaptability meant that farmers could become pilots, engineers could become commandos, and teachers could become tactical analysts in timeframes that would seem impossible to more specialized alien minds. Diplomat Yoon Ji-ho explained how humanity's network of trade contacts and cultural exchange programs had actually been intelligence-gathering operations. Every alien they had met, every technology they had observed, and every cultural detail they had learned was now part of a comprehensive database that would guide human strategy. The session continued for 18 straight hours, as every aspect of humanity's response was planned, coordinated, and approved. There were no dissenting votes, no regional conflicts, and no political arguments about resource allocation. Humanity had been challenged by forces that threatened their existence, and they responded with a unity that would have been impossible. Under any other circumstances, President Kim closed the session by announcing the message that would be transmitted to the Galactic Council in response to their ultimatum. The response was not a lengthy diplomatic document or a detailed explanation of humanity's position. Instead, it was 3 simple words that would soon become the most feared phrase in galactic history: come and take it. The transmission was sent on all frequencies in every language used by Council species. It was brief, direct, and completely unambiguous in its meaning. Humanity had heard the Council's demands and had chosen to fight rather than surrender. The aliens wanted human worlds, human resources, and human submission. They were welcome to try to take them. As the emergency session ended and representatives began returning to their home regions to oversee mobilization efforts, one final message was broadcast to every human settlement across the galaxy. The message came directly from President Kim, and it carried the authority of the entire human species, citizens of Earth and all human colonies. He began his voice steady, despite the magnitude of what he was announcing. Our species has been challenged by forces that consider us inferior and expendable. They have. The Great Council Hall stretched far beyond what any human eye could see comfortably. Massive pillars made of strange glowing crystal held up a ceiling that seemed to touch the stars themselves. Thousands of alien beings filled the enormous space, each one representing a different world and a different way of thinking about the universe. Ambassador Kretal stood at the center podium, his reptilian scales catching the harsh artificial light that bathed the chamber. His species, the Vorthans, had conquered over 200 worlds in the past 1,000 years, and his pride showed in every movement of his powerful body. Behind him, a holographic display showed a small blue and green planet spinning slowly in the darkness of space. The planet looked so ordinary, so peaceful, and so completely defenseless that several council members had begun laughing before Kretal even started speaking. This was Earth, the home world of the species that called themselves humans, and today the Galactic Council would decide their fate. Kretal raised his clawed hand and the laughter died down to respectful silence. His yellow eyes swept across the assembled representatives before settling on a small group sitting in the observer section. The humans had been invited to witness this moment not out of respect, but to make sure they understood exactly how powerless they were. Captain Lee Dong-woo sat perfectly still in his simple blue uniform. The Earth Defense Force insignia on his chest seemed almost childlike compared to the elaborate symbols worn by the alien representatives around him. Next to him, Dr. Park So-young took notes on a basic electronic tablet, while the most advanced species in the galaxy used technology that could bend reality itself. The captain had served in Earth's small space fleet for 15 years and had seen many things that would have surprised his ancestors. First contact with alien life had happened only 20 years ago, and humanity was still struggling to understand their place in a universe full of beings who had mastered space travel when humans were still learning to make fire. Dr. Park was one of Earth's leading experts on alien biology and psychology. She had spent the last decade studying every species they had encountered, trying to understand how different minds worked and how humans could find their place among the stars. What she had learned worried her more than she let anyone know. The other human observers included General Kim Tae-won from Earth's military command, engineer Nam Hae-rim, who had helped design humanity's first real starships, and diplomat Yoon Ji-ho, who had been trying to negotiate trade agreements and peaceful relations with various alien species. None of them looked particularly impressive by galactic standards. Humans were smaller than most species, weaker than many, and their technology was primitive compared to civilizations that had been exploring space for thousands of years. But they had all volunteered to come here, knowing that they might be witnessing the end of human independence. Kretal began his speech with the confidence of someone who had never known defeat. His voice carried easily through the vast chamber thanks to translation devices that converted his hissing reptilian language into something every species could understand. These creatures that call themselves humans have been given more chances than they deserve, he said while gesturing dismissively at the holographic Earth. They were contacted by our scouts and offered the opportunity to become a protected species under Galactic Council guidance. They were shown the benefits of joining our civilization and accepting their proper place in the natural order. He paused to let his words sink in before continuing with growing anger in his voice. Instead of showing proper gratitude, they have refused our generous offers. They insist on maintaining their primitive independence. They have even had the audacity to establish colonies on worlds that rightfully belong to more advanced species. The murmur of agreement from the council members grew louder. Many species had followed similar paths when first contacted by the galaxy's major powers. Some had been wise enough to accept subordinate status and had prospered under the guidance of their betters. Others had foolishly resisted and had been conquered for their own good. But humans seemed different from other primitive species in ways that made the established powers uncomfortable. They learned quickly, adapted to new situations, and showed a disturbing tendency to find solutions to problems that should have been impossible for such a young species to solve. Engineer Nam had noticed this during her time working with alien technology. Human scientists and engineers seemed to approach problems from angles that more advanced species never considered. Where aliens saw established rules and proven methods, humans saw interesting puzzles that could be solved in completely new ways. General Kim had observed similar patterns in military exercises. When shown standard galactic combat techniques, human soldiers would inevitably start experimenting with modifications and improvements that veteran alien warriors found confusing and unpredictable. Kretal continued his presentation by showing tactical displays of human military capabilities. The numbers were laughably small by galactic standards. Humanity could field fewer than 100 combat spacecraft, while the Vorthan Empire alone possessed over 10,000. Human weapons were based on primitive chemical reactions and simple kinetic energy, while advanced species used plasma beams and reality-warping field generators. The human population of less than 12 billion spread across only 4 worlds seemed insignificant compared to the trillions of beings who owed allegiance to various council members. Their industrial capacity was minimal, their resource extraction primitive, and their scientific knowledge centuries behind the galactic standard. Most damaging of all from the Council's perspective was humanity's strange obsession with individual rights and democratic decision-making. Efficient species were ruled by strong leaders who could make quick decisions without wasting time consulting with inferior beings. Humans somehow managed to function, despite allowing every adult member of their species to participate in choosing their government. This philosophical difference was actually what had brought the current crisis to a head. The Vorthan Empire needed to expand their mining operations and had identified 3 worlds in human space that contained valuable mineral deposits. Under normal galactic law, these resources would be claimed by the stronger species, and the weaker species would be relocated to less valuable territory. When the Vorthans had approached human authorities with this reasonable proposal, they had been politely but firmly refused. Human representatives had explained that those worlds contained established colonies with millions of inhabitants who could not simply be moved to accommodate mining operations. The refusal had shocked Vorthon leadership, who had never encountered a species weak enough to be easily conquered, but stubborn enough to reject obvious reality. This led to the current council session where a formal ultimatum would be delivered, and humanity would be given one last chance to accept their natural place in the galactic order. Kretal concluded his presentation by outlining the terms that would be offered to humanity. They would have 30 Earth days to evacuate their 3 most valuable colony worlds and relocate their populations to designated areas. Their military would be disbanded and their weapons technology turned over to council authorities. Human space travel would be restricted to approved routes, and all scientific research would be supervised by more advanced species. In exchange for accepting these reasonable limitations, humanity would receive protection from other potentially hostile species and access to certain approved galactic technologies that would improve their quality of life. They would be treated fairly, as long as they accepted their limitations and stopped trying to compete with their obvious superiors. Captain. Lee rose slowly from his seat when Kretal finished speaking. His movements were calm and controlled, showing none of the fear or anger that the council members expected to see. He walked to the speaking position reserved for observer comments and looked out at the thousands of alien beings who held his species' future in their various hands, claws, and tentacles. "We will deliver your message to our government," he said in a quiet voice that somehow carried clearly through the enormous chamber. His tone held no pleading, no anger, and no hint of the desperation that weaker species usually showed when facing impossible odds. The simple dignity of his response made several council members shift uncomfortably in their seats. They had expected tears or rage or desperate attempts at negotiation. Instead, they got calm acceptance that felt somehow more threatening than any emotional outburst would have been. Dr. Park and the other human observers stood and followed their captain toward the exit. None of them looked back at the council members, who were already beginning to discuss how humanity's resources would be divided among the victorious species. The humans had heard everything they needed to hear, and now it was time to return home with news that would change everything. As the human delegation reached the great doors of the council chamber, Kretal called out one final statement meant to ensure they understood their situation completely. "Tell your leaders that this offer will not be repeated," he said with satisfaction, evident in his reptilian voice. "When we return in 30 days, we expect to find compliance, or we will take what we require by force." Captain Lee paused at the doorway and looked back at the assembled representatives of Galactic. The surrender came not as a single moment, but as an avalanche of capitulation that swept across council space. Species that had ruled the galaxy for millennia found themselves begging for mercy from creatures they had mocked just months before. The formal ceremony took place on neutral ground, the space station orbiting the dead world of Corvex, where the first interstellar war crimes tribunal had been held 3,000 years ago. President Kim Min-ho stood before the assembled representatives of 47 alien species, each one bearing the scars of humanity's devastating campaign. He wore no ceremonial robes, carried no symbols of conquest, and spoke in the same quiet tone that had characterized human diplomacy since first contact. But everyone in the chamber understood that they were witnessing the birth of a new galactic order. "The war is over," President Kim announced. "Not because we have conquered you, but because you have finally understood what we tried to tell you from the beginning. Humans prefer peace, but we excel at war." The terms of surrender were unlike anything in galactic history. Admiral Yijin, now Supreme Commander of Human Space Forces, outlined the new reality with clinical precision. There would be no subjugation of council species, no territorial seizures, no enslavement or genocide. Instead, humanity demanded something far more valuable: respect. Dr. Park So-young, now Earth Secretary of Xenological Affairs, presented the scientific findings that had made human victory inevitable. "You underestimated us because you judged our species by your own limitations," she explained. "You cannot adapt as quickly as we do. You cannot think as creatively as we do. You cannot endure what we endure or sacrifice what we sacrifice. Most importantly, You cannot unite as we unite when faced with extinction. The new Galactic Constitution, drafted by Professor Lee Myung-soo and his team of human legal experts, established principles that no council species had ever considered. Individual rights superseded collective authority. Cultural diversity was protected rather than eliminated. Most revolutionary of all, the right to resist unjust authority was recognized as fundamental to sentient existence. Colonel Oh Sung-min, now director of Galactic Peacekeeping, established the new military doctrine. Human forces would maintain bases throughout former council space, not as occupiers but as guarantors of peace. Any species attempting to resume the old patterns of conquest and subjugation would face the same devastating response that had brought down the council. Captain Lee Dong-woo, the quiet observer who had witnessed humanity's initial humiliation, now served as the first human ambassador to the reformed Galactic Assembly. His opening speech became required reading in diplomatic schools across known space. You challenged the wrong species, and now you fear our name. But fear is not what we want from you. We want partnership, cooperation, and the kind of peace that comes from mutual respect rather than mutual destruction. The transformation was remarkable. Species that had been enemies for millennia began working together under human supervision. Technologies that had been hoarded for competitive advantage were shared for collective benefit. The galaxy began to heal from wounds that had festered for thousands of years. Years later, when young aliens asked their elders about the Great War, the answer was always the same. We thought humans were weak because they chose diplomacy over conquest. We learned that they choose diplomacy because they are too dangerous to be allowed to choose anything else. Never forget, humans prefer peace, but when forced to fight, they don't fight to win. They fight to make sure the fight never happens again. The age of human dominance had begun not through conquest, but through the simple demonstration that some species are too dangerous to threaten and too valuable to destroy.